Good morning. So, are you one encounter away from greatness? So, I went to listen to a great artist talk with Tim Whiten 10 days ago, maybe at the AGO, the Art Gallery of Ontario. And I was really struck by how he was mentioning a few people, one in particular that had been, instrumental in his career. And that really made me think about are you one encounter away from greatness and success? So that's what we're talking about today. My name is Peggy van der Plassche. Thank you so much for listening to that episode. And, we really tend to always look at success as if it is, self-made, this idea that it's an isolated force of, will or talent, especially, I would say, with the hustle culture and the tech brainwashing. But very often success is relationship. It's a conversation, it's a connection, it's a really quiet, decisive nudge in the right direction. And maybe you felt that in your own life and career. I certainly had people telling me, wow, after the coffee we had together, I changed job or I decided to apply to a different company. And it's funny because you don't necessarily realize when you have a conversation, because we have many conversations like that you might be nudging someone in a direction they might not have tried before, and hopefully a better direction for themselves. And I remember once I was going to say a coffee, but it's a lie. It was a glass of wine with this very successful entrepreneur, and it was, gosh, nine years ago now. And he told me I always bet on myself. And it stayed with me because first I had never really bet on myself, or at least not consciously. Technically, I bet on myself when I moved to Canada, and every time I changed job for a better job, I guess. But um, it was conscious, but I'm not sure it was as clear and crisp that guy vision had of himself. And I certainly didn't do it with as much self-confidence than he did. And it's something that stayed with me because it really helped me open the Pandora box of why am I not like that? Why am I not betting on myself? Why I had so many colleagues, bosses who betted on me. And I was not the first person betting on myself. It doesn't make any sense. So when I went to this talk last week, so Tim is a brilliant artist. He's Toronto based, but he was born in the US. He was born in Michigan, Chicago actually, the suburbs in Chicago. He's 81 or 84. Anyway, he's in his 80s. And he even did the Vietnam War, grew up in poverty in Michigan, and maybe it was Detroit, actually. Can't remember exactly. Anyway, in the northeast of the US. And he ended up being a very successful artist. And if you know, being a successful artist, I spoke about that in the past, I wrote about that in the past. It is not an easy feat. So when you add to that someone who was Afro-American, born from poverty, survived the Vietnam War, it's the cards are pretty stacked against you, and nonetheless, he is very, very successful. And his work is very interesting because and I should mention that Tim has studied in philosophy and in psychology. So he has a different approach to things. And his work really, I would say, blur the line between matter and meaning. So he really puts a lot of emphasis on how you experience the piece versus explaining you how you should experience the piece, which I think is quite interesting in art. Very often you have the powers that be that tell you what you should feel and think about an artist and his work. That's exactly the other way around for Tim. And so I first discovered him for a gallery here in Toronto that's called Olga Korper Gallery. So the founder, obviously, her name is Olga Korper, a very interesting and impressive lady on her own right. And after hearing him speak 10 days ago, because I discovered him maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I think, I really found myself even more drawn to him, and the pieces he put together, knowing his personality, knowing his background, knowing more about who he thought, but also knowing his generosity of thoughts and knowing his how smart and how thoughtful he was. And what really unfolded, I would say, during this conversation was more than an artist talk. It was really, I would say, just a meditation on mentorship. But, he obviously talked, and I'm going to go invite in a second, but about this key encounter. Olga is one. He talked about the nature of consciousness, the mysterious ways, lives intertwine to shape what we call art, and also who we become in the process. And I think for him, art is really about this idea of self-discovery and constant learning. So it's not just art for art. There is a whole idea about self-actualization through the process, the artistic process, not just for the artist, for also, the people experiencing the pieces. So if you've never been, and maybe you're from Toronto, maybe you're not, but if you are, I recommend a visit to Olga Korper Gallery. It's close to the MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art. If you're not from Toronto, well, find a reason to come, ideally in the summer, because otherwise it's not as nice. And if you like art, I really recommend to visit that gallery. It's actually more a sanctuary than a showroom, and it has none of this pretentious feel that you can see in other gallery, and they represent very, very strong artists. So Tim is one of them, and I'm not going to go through all his credit, but it's very impressive. He's having a show right now at the AGO that's already saying it all. They represent Denis Thomasos, they represent Mélanie Augier, they represent a lot of successful artists. So it's a very, very solid gallery. And his current exhibition at the AGO actually is called A Little Bit of Light. And that exhibition really showcased 5 decades of 50 years of his exploration, spiritual, intellectual, human, and the materials that Tim uses, glass, he loves glass, but crystal, bone, cotton, leather, he really looks at it as metaphors. And again, his work is not meant to be explained, it is meant to be experienced. And it really feels less like a product, and more like a presence, really. And again, as much as the art is and his thoughts behind that were, what struck me the most was the story, his story behind it, and really this idea of the power of one person. So during the talk, Tim mentioned several people who shaped his path, and his mother, and she, I can't even imagine how she would have been, I assume she passed, but I guess she would have been 100 and so right now. So obviously a few generations away from us, coming from an Afro-American background in the US, in poverty area, and someone who was nonetheless enlightened or smart enough to push, and he has siblings, his kids with learning as a way of being. And I have to say, I'm always very impressed to see people, especially when they have adverse circumstances, being that aware, that, again, enlightened, to be able to give their kids that type of advice that I don't even see today with parents who have way more opportunities to be, I would say, aware and elevated, give to their kids in 2025. Advice I certainly didn't have, let's be honest. So he was very, very influenced by his mom. Second person he mentioned is a gentleman from the name of Oscar Oppenheimer. And Oscar Oppenheimer was a philosopher, psychologist. So I mentioned that Tim studied both. And Oscar Oppenheimer really guided Tim thinking. And they stayed in touch until Mr. Oppenheimer's death. they were writing, they were exchanging, the old school way kind of when you read about philosophers from like 300 or 400 years ago who used to exchange letters. And I thought it was very, very interesting to have these key people in his life. I was trying to think about who would be my key people, but usually they were more negative mentors and things I didn't want to do, looking at them versus positive influence. That's another story. But one name really echoed the loudest in his presentation. And again, it was Olga Korper. And he said it plainly during his talk, without Olga, who would I be? And, that really resonated with me because the question is, okay, so would someone else have played a role in his life? Would he have found another way to make it? Maybe, maybe not in the same way or with the same reach, or maybe better. Who knows? Maybe he would have been more successful. And, it's really a reminder as well that a single person can have a huge impact, a huge shift in the course of a life. An advocate, a curator, a friend. Of course, in the case of Tim's story, I mentioned people who lifted him up. Of course, we cannot run 5 parallel realities at the same time. Maybe he would have made it alone. Maybe he would have made it better alone. Maybe he would have been better with someone else. I think it's likely it's the other way around, but we don't know. It's also, unfortunately, sometimes the impact of someone who brings us down and is not gonna be that positive influence in our life and was gonna channel us in the wrong direction. So that's something I don't necessarily want to explore right now, but it's also something I want to put a seed in your mind, is that sometimes it's just one event, one word, one person, and your life takes a different turn, sometimes for the best, sometimes not so much. But his talk, it was not just a story about mentorship, it was really about presence. And again, about how this one moment, this one encounter can really widen a door that changes everything. And sometimes it's not necessarily someone who help you and open a door. Olga did so because she represented him and helped him obviously show his work, but it can be someone who opened a world you would have never thought of, and maybe someone you'll never see again. So it has many aspects. And if I looked at Tim, it really made me think about someone with a philosopher's hand and a psychologist's heart. You could feel how compassionate he was, how wise he was, how self-actualized he was. Some of the questions from the audience were, really not smart, as it tends to be sometimes. And he was so graceful. I mean, honestly, I've rarely seen someone as graceful. And, the person I was with is like, well, he's in his 80s. I'm like, well, if you want, I can introduce you to a lot of people in my family. And I can tell you, they might not be in their 80s yet, but I doubt very much they get to a level of enlightenment when they reach that age, if they reach that age. So it's not necessarily a question of age. And what I love with him is that, and because obviously I love that because that's what I believe as well, is that the older you get, hopefully the wiser you get, and you realize the less you know. And I think that's really something that I loved with Tim, is this idea that he really doesn't pretend to know. He really doesn't pretend to. He's a teacher as well, actually, but he really doesn't pretend that he has the recipe, if I can say that. And again, what's very interesting when you look at his work, and I really recommend you to check out his exhibit. I think it's until August, actually. What you really feel in his work is really this background in philosophy and psychology, actually. Of course, hearing him talk put it even more in context. And actually, there's going to be a Netflix documentary on Tim's work and Tim's life coming out this year in 2025. I don't know exactly when, but it's coming out. And what I love with him, again, is that his art doesn't answer questions. It invites questions from the audience, and it really resists this categorization that we love doing, I would say, even more the art world. Even the label art, it doesn't want to call his work art, which I thought very interesting. What he creates, he really looks at it as a form of human investigation, like it's a mix of ritual, it's a mix of reflection, and I put some words in his mouth, and it's really this idea that experience precedes language, and it's by explaining or trying to explain a work, you're reducing it, because we don't necessarily have languages that are sophisticated enough to really, in infinite details, explain the feelings and how you feel about that work. So what he really recommend, and which I like as a way of looking at the art, is immersing in the art and let go of like the little explainer on the side and all the context, which is actually very different from most art professionals usually focus on context. Who's the artist? Does he or she has a MFA? Where did they show? Like what's their gender? What's their cultural background? What's their sexual orientation? All that stuff, because context influence the work. And I know some collectors, they don't want to buy work that is not from a certain fringe of the population. And it's so different, like he has an approach that's so much more inviting and so much more democratic than the elitist approach that you can unfortunately feel a lot in the artistic world, especially in places like New York and Paris, London, the usual stuff, So when you really engage in Tim's installations, and when I say installations, that can be any type of work, that can be a painting, that can be a sculpture, whatever type of work, you're not just observing, you're really participating in that work. And I find it very, very interesting. And at the end of the day, you can do that with any artist. It's your prerogative, like even if a collector, a gallerist, even the artist himself or herself wants to give you the entire context, well, it's your choice to say, I agree, I don't agree, I don't care, I'm just interested in the piece of art. So I thought that very important, very empowering. And I think that's a message I can never share enough about empowerment. Who cares what people are telling you to do? You do what's good for you, and what's good for you is your own opinion that are coming from your own senses. But for that, we need a lot of confidence. And what was very interesting also across the exhibition was recurring motif of transition, like darkness to light, hence the title, dense to transparent. And that's really mirroring Tim's own spiritual evolution. These are not just sculptures or symbols, they're really allegories, as he put it, like a path that is always unfolding. So you, me, anyone might see different things, and you might see different things each time you look at it. And that's so interesting and so engaging to look at a work and every time seeing something that is different. And it is by design in Tim's work, you have multiple interpretations, you have multiple entry points, because again, he looks at self-discovery as a living process. His process is really about, again, this elevation. So I would say it really reminds us of many things. And these are things we tend to forget in our, like outcome, obsessed, optimized world. So the first thing is really about learning. He talks a lot about learning because, as I mentioned, he's a teacher. Learning is the student responsibility. Yes, the teacher is there to support the student, but it is the student who is learning in his hands. Second is really about this idea that the work, it holds no answers. It just holds questions. It is really for you to make your own mind. And the last one, which is the one the point I led with, it's really that one person, one gallerist in that context, but one mentor, one moment, can leave an indelible mark on your life or someone else's life as well. And again, that's a little bit of light and a lot of truth. So I again really recommend you, if you're around, to check out his exhibition, but more importantly about rethinking how in your life maybe you had this positive or these negative influences, and how are you yourself in some degrees, hopefully a positive influence, but sometimes a negative influence as well, and how maybe you can make someone's career that 50 years later is going to say, well, without him or her, I wouldn't be there. So thank you again for watching and listening. My name is Peggy van de Plassche. You can find all the info in the show notes if you want to check out my background. And please don't hesitate to, share, comment. I'm always super interested in hearing what people think actually about what I say, because again, it's more about raising questions than bringing answers. I show my own perspective. I don't pretend that it's the only perspective. And I'm always interested in hearing about others' point of view. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm wishing you a wonderful week. Bye bye.